Hello everyone, my name's Edward Danon and I'm a director at Voicevale. We are suppliers of nuts, dried fruit, seeds and grains, coffee and superfoods to markets around the world. We proudly have offices in Beijing and an incredible team here since 1996. Among the products which I manage for Voicevale, very close to my heart are Brazil nuts, and that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. Now, most of you will be looking at the screen, most of you wonder what is that animal, but some of you might be wondering why there's a labubu floating down a river in a Brazil nut pod carrying some Brazil nuts. Well, honestly, I just thought it was quite cute, and my kids are already insisting I bring back a real labubu from China. But more than that, I think labubu makes a great mascot for Brazil nuts. They're both a bit wild, they're a little magical, they're deeply connected to a fragile ecosystem, and just like labubus, Brazil nuts are finally finding their way to exciting new markets, especially here in China. So after the picture, which my father said don't include no one will know what it is, I'll click through to the next slide. So now to the real topics. I'll be discussing about Brazil nuts. So where they're from, the lungs of the earth, that they face some significant challenges. They're a beautiful nut, but they're a complicated one. And the complicated story continues in this year, 2025. I'll then look to the future, 2026. We'll talk about the great story of the Chinese growth, which we're seeing now, and then talk about what we do to build resilience into the supply chain. And then I'll sum it all up and go over everything which I have said already. So where they're from. So for the last, I think, 3 years in this presentation, we've been explaining some of these points. But they're from South America. They're from the Amazon rainforest, which is the only place in the world which they grow. They grow for certain conditions which only exist in the Amazon. The Amazon spans 9 countries. 60% of the Amazon is in Brazil, 13% in Peru, and only 7% in Bolivia. Even though these figures, Bolivia is still the largest exporter of Brazil nuts to the world. As I mentioned, it's the only place on the planet which grows Brazils. And the reason for that are these pictures which you can see on the screen. So at the bottom left, there's a very special bee. And this bee is the only bee which is strong enough to enter into the flower of a Brazil nut tree and pollinate it. So you might be able to grow Brazil nuts, but you will not be able to pollinate them unless you're willing to climb up 30 meters high once it's fully grown and start opening up flowers and pollinating, which I'm not sure is possible. And then the other interesting fact about Brazils is how they spread throughout the forests. So a particular animal called an agouti, which is like a rather large rodent, collects Brazil nuts and buries them. So they move and naturally spread by the agouti forgetting where he's buried them, and then Brazil nut trees grow. You also find them in greater densities where populations have at some point lived in the forest. So you find more Brazil nuts, but they are completely wild. Being from the Amazon, they are unfortunately under threat, and they're under threat from 4 main factors. The first being deforestation. So the picture on this slide is pretty because you see a beautiful Brazil nut tree, but it's also the signs of the changing ecosystem of the Amazon, where in the foreground you see corn growing for agriculture, and that corn's being grown to feed what's in the background, which are cattle, which are also being planted along being grown around the Amazon in Brazil. The second point is pollination disruption. So if you imagine this Brazil nut tree is in the middle on its own, it doesn't have a canopy or the environment for the bees to move to pollinate the tree. So eventually that tree will unfortunately die. Lack of cultivation. It's not just an agouti's job to plant Brazil nuts. It has to be now planted by people to increase the yields around the forest, increase them in areas which are easier to reach, but there isn't a huge amount of cultivation happening. And the fourth factor, really important, mentioned many times, is climate change and the impact on the environment in which they grow. So to the first point, deforestation. This is a video which I took out of a car driving in Brazil, and you can see lots of beautiful dying Brazil nut trees, and in between the trees you'll see cattle, you'll see agriculture, and it goes on and on and on, and it's for large distances. cattle farmers are proud to say, oh, I've got a lot of Brazil nut trees on our farm. We see them very clearly because we've cleared all the forest around them. So unfortunately, this is an ever increasing, and we need to find a way to stop it, to make something more profitable than doing this. The next point is the issue of the of the changing climate. And the changing climate has had an effect has had two effects, or one effect and a further impact. And it's the fires in the Amazon. So extreme drought caused by El Nino has meant that last year was the worst year for fires in the last 20 years. To put that in perspective, there was 44 million hectares burned across the Brazilian Amazon and the whole of the Amazon region, which is the size of the Heilongjiang province. So it's a vast area of land which was destroyed by fire. Pretty drastic. So all this doom and gloom, we'll get to the good part soon, it's okay, there is a future. Through to the impact of the crop. So because of the extreme weather conditions, in terms of the dryness, not so much the fires, which actually didn't burn a huge amount of Brazil nut land, but the dryness in the forest caused the size of the 2025 crop to reduce dramatically. We're still in that crop now, so it's still being processed. The very last is being processed and exported now. So there were two things. The size of the crop decreased and the size of the nuts decreased. So you can see on the top left picture, on top of a MacBook, there are the Brazil nuts which are not in shell, which are of a normal crop, large Brazil nuts to the top of the laptop, and to the bottom of the laptop you can see the crop which we got now. You can also see some pods, small pods in the bottom left, and to the right is the distribution of that crop, the sizes. So normal grades, or the majority of grades, is large, medium, midget, tiny. And you can review back this slide later, but large decreased significantly, mediums also decreased significantly, and we found many more midgets and even more tinies, and super tinies or super tinies, which look like little almonds, which are very tasty, would be good for chocolate, but it won't be a consistent thing that we get a product like that. So this is about the exports. Generally, Bolivia, Peru, and Brazil will export approximately 32,000 metric tons of kernels each year. The graph below shows the split between Bolivia, Peru, and Brazil, and it shows the exports from January to May comparing to previous January to Mays. So comparing previous January to May this year, we are already down 30% on exports, remembering that the majority of the exports will happen in the earlier part of the year. So we're expecting there to be at least 30, probably much more in terms of a reduction of the 2025 crop. And you can imagine the impact of that. So the starting price of Brazil nuts, say, were around $4.50 per pound. Then it pushed all the way up to $9 and higher, $9.30 per pound. So those who, luckily for China, had good stocks, so there's still some available in the market from previous year. But the impact on that, especially into Europe, is that there were some retailers who decided to use a nice term and hibernate the line of Brazil nuts. So they will put on pause Brazil nuts for the season, but knowing how important they are for the environment, for consumers who want to consume Brazil nuts, they look to include them back in when the crop starts in 2026. So what's going to happen in 2026? Well, luckily, we have a bit of history on that. In 2027, there was also a crop failure where there was a big reduction. And a study done by Embrapa, who are a Brazilian researcher, pointed towards when the trees have been through a stress, normally in the subsequent season, they are more likely to fruit more products to compensate from the stress of the previous year because they want to grow and they want to spread seeds. So the likelihood, as happened after the 2017 issue, is that there will be a big crop the following season. So in all likelihood, we will be hoping to have many more Brazil nuts to sell. And in conversation with people when I was in Bolivia talking to communities, they were extremely worried about the global market stopping to consume Brazil nuts because they want them to be, they know they will be there in the future. And my promise to them was keep collecting them, keep looking after them, keep processing them, and we will continue to buy them. If we think about Brazil nuts as a crop, it's extremely small. We mentioned earlier by stats from the INC that the total kernel production of all nuts is 6 million. Brazil nuts makes up 0.5% of that. So it's very easy for us to consume that, and we must. The other important point will be Brazil nuts historically position themselves in terms of price with the nuts which had the highest volume. So they were more similar to an almond and a cashew, as opposed to positioning themselves in price closer to a pecan or closer to a macadamia. And I think the correction we might see now, once people are more aware of Brazil nuts and knowing their heritage, will be that they will more be within that line. But I don't believe they can maintain a big premium to that. So that's my hope, at least. So to Chinese growth. So 3 years ago in Linan, I said we are going to push China. There will be a big crop, and I think Brazil nuts has a great opportunity for growth in China. And fortunately, since that, most likely because of that presentation, it has now increased up to nearly 1,000 tons of kernels coming from Bolivia, Peru, and Brazil into China. So there is definitely appetite for the product here. We have been delayed by the issue of this year's crop, but I think that now that China has a taste for these products, it can continue and we're ready to grow. So China is an emerging market for Brazil nuts, and I believe, at least, we're on the cusp of going mainstream. There are a few reasons for that, and I think a lot of them are down to the product. It's a natural, nutrient-dense product. Lots of the middle class consume them. It's extremely high in selenium. You just need to consume one of them to have your whole, even more than your daily allowance. There's more availability around the world, more availability on different websites where you're able to get them. And they can be seen as the frontier, a premium product. I was in Hippo Fresh and I saw a crazy product where I ate a cashew and it tasted like grapefruit, and then it started to explode in my mouth with popping candy. China are on the forefront of developing new, exciting products, and I think Brazil nuts can meet that. Talking about the next bit of how we need to build resilience into the supply chain. So Voicevale have been running a project. We're into, I think, our 6th year of trying to build resilience in terms of the communities. So collecting Brazil nuts is a tough job. We need to conserve the forests, and we need to protect the people who go into the forest to get the Brazil nuts out. So to do that, we need to improve their health, provide medical kits when they're there, which aren't readily available, improve their access to water, so distribute different water filtration systems. You think of the Amazon as full of water, it's not. You have to either dig deep or bring it in or filter the water to drink it. There's another project going on in Brazil. This is led by Embrapa. It's interesting ways to increase the yields. So you can do things like cut vines, which strangle trees, which reduce their productivity, and then help younger trees to survive, because they've got to grow in these areas where there's a lot around. So if you clear a bit, you can enable a young Brazil nut tree to thrive. And then lastly, another project called Florestania, which is an amazing one in Cobija, where they are proving you can reforest degraded land. So they have ways of planting particular trees which bring back fertility into the soil, and then they grow cacao, they grow acai, they grow banana, they grow yucca, and they grow Brazil nut trees, all on previously degraded land. So why are we going to fight this battle? How are we going to seize the opportunity? And why? So Brazil nuts are harvested from wild trees in the Amazon. They rely on a complex relationship between the giant trees and the bees, and they're very rich in selenium. They provide healthy fats, and as mentioned, they massively support the local people, and they support the Amazon, which the people live in. They have these challenges. We have fires, we have heat, we have logistics. I haven't even spoken about governments, and that's a massive factor. And they're under threat, and so are the environments. They're an extremely rare but important example of how you can market demand can align to protect a forest. So they're extremely sustainable, and they help us meet sustainability goals. And just to skip to the very last point, supporting Brazil nuts is a battle, but it's definitely worth fighting. I look forward to developing Brazil nuts in the Chinese market with everybody. Thank you very much.
谢谢，感谢 Edward 先生的介绍，也希望未来鲍鱼果在中国市场的发展更进一步。再一次